Hey everybody, Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. As I'm sure you saw over the weekend, US forces pulled off an amazing strike in Venezuela and were able to grab Nicolas Maduro, the president of that country, and extradite him back to the US. As amazing as that was, the president held a press conference on the 3rd of January, on Saturday the 3rd, which I think to me anyway, from an oil perspective, raised as many questions as it did provide answers for. But let's dig into that right now in This Week in Oil. Hey, I'm Aaron with over 30 years of experience in oil trading and analytics, and I'm here to elevate your understanding of the oil market. Okay, here's a quick presentation I made to help us get through some of these points. I don't want to forget them, and I want you to be able to sort of see them. Okay, let's start off with a price chart here. So, this is a daily chart of WTI. I wanted to point out this trend line that I put in on Friday. I was getting pretty worried on Friday the way the market was performing, and I saw this, it looked like to be a pretty good upward support line. The fact that at least so far today on Monday morning, the 5th, we're currently right at or above that trend line is somewhat comforting to me coming from a more bullish perspective on the market. Not super bullish, but think overall prices are just too low. So I think this is a good result in terms of the technicals. I think it's also a good reading of what's actually going on in Venezuela, and that's really what I wanted to get to today. But I thought I'd point that out to you too, that we are getting a bounce higher in the market here so far this morning. So a couple things that you need to know, sort of going into all of this situation in Venezuela, is one that as of Thursday, which would have been the 1st of January, production was pretty much stopped in Venezuela. So for a couple of things, of course, that armada of vessels that the U.S. has parked off the coast, the seizure of at least two vessels, um, made everyone else pretty nervous about coming in there, especially if they were shadow fleet tankers or had some other sort of sanctions attached to them. And so as a result, loadings have pretty much gone to zero. Even the Chevron loadings, which they have a special license from the U.S. government, by Thursday, those also pretty much halted as well. I don't think, as far as I know, Chevron hasn't loaded anything since this so far this year, since Thursday. Um, and of course, as I've explained before, this really heavy crude is so thick and viscous it won't flow without some sort of diluent or something to dilute it. A lot of that diluent had been coming from Russia in the form of naphtha, and if those boats can't get through to offload the naphtha, then Venezuela has a pretty hard time on their own of coming up with enough naphtha to blend down their crude to make it flowable to get through the pipelines to load on ships, et cetera, et cetera. So it's not as straightforward as it is, say, with shale crude, which is already a pretty light crude, and it's easy to flow on the pipeline, and there's no, many times there's no other concerns to worry about once it comes out of the ground. But in Venezuela, at least the Orinoco, the heavier stuff, there you do have these sorts of concerns you have to worry about. It's sort of similar to Canadian heavy crude in that regard. You sort of have to upgrade the bitumen to get it to a place where you can um, move it on down the line to be further processed by refineries. So at any rate, just want to point out that back in November, production was, right at 1 million barrels per day, a little bit less. I saw a Bloomberg article saying 1.1. I saw other things saying 900,000 barrels per day, but in that ballpark. November numbers so far look like they're coming out to about 500,000 barrels per day. And of course, so far in January, only 5 days into it, we're pretty close to zero. So that's where I'm saying that the market is probably correct in being a little bit more bullish here this morning, bouncing up a little bit higher because the immediate impact of this weekend's actions and of the naval blockade of the country is that flows have gone to zero. So that's the really big thing I want to point out to you for right now. Number two, Trump's been telling the oil companies, again, there's been a couple emails going back and forth or news stories, especially from Bloomberg, going back and forth that I wanted to pass by you. I'm not sure that they're getting picked up by the larger news agencies, or at least being distilled down to sort of the public, to my audience here. So wanted to share that with you really quick. Pretty much President Trump is saying that the U.S. oil companies, if you lost something due to the nationalization of PDVSA, if they went in there and seized your assets, your rigs, your pipeline, your refinery, um, they have there were a lot of refining capacity, or there was a lot of refining capacity in Venezuela previously that had been sort of backfilled by U.S. companies. So if you had lost any of that to nationalization, President Trump is saying you need to get back down there quickly and start investing money back into their dilapidated system to bring it sort of back up to speed, because in his mind he needs to get the oil flowing again, uh, to sort of keep the country stable. Of course, PDVSA too, but the entire country will start to stabilize again once oil dollars start flowing back in again. It's a question of, at this point, who distributes that income, who distributes that money, and to what extent it filters down to the regular people. And I think there's a lot to be figured out on that part of it. But in terms of the infrastructure, President Trump made somewhat confusing claims that I have here in part B, saying that oil companies are going to pay for the upgrades directly. They'll be reimbursed by what they're doing. He doesn't say reimbursed by who or how that's going to get done, but it's going to get paid, and we're going to get the oil flowing again. So again, it seems like it's a pretty tall ask at this point. I'll get to this a little bit in the next slide, but it is a pretty big ask at this point to ask U.S. oil companies to sort of jump back down in there while we're still trying to figure out what exactly is going on with the future of the company. With the future of the country, in regards to who's actually going to be running it, what sort of pushback will there ultimately be? They say the U.S. is going to control the country, at least for an interim time period. How much pushback is there going to be, especially from people inside PDVSA, because this being an oil channel, and that sort of thing? How easily, even if we did go down there with the best intentions of rebuilding their infrastructure, their oil infrastructure, how much pushback are you going to get, or cooperation would you be getting from current PDVSA employees to help, all that to go smoothly or not? I think those are still pretty big questions that are up in the air. And then a Bloomberg story also revealed something interesting, and I would love to know a little bit more backstory on it. But just here's one line I picked out of the Bloomberg article, saying that there's a group of former PDVSA employees who have been meeting for months in the U.S. I think they even said, for up to a year in the U.S. to develop a plan to get PDVSA sort of back up and going again. And I keep using that term, PDVSA, Petroleum de Venezuela S.A., is the full name of the nationalized oil company in Venezuela. So sorry for not explaining that earlier, but PDVSA is pretty much what we always called it in the oil industry. So anyway, I think that's interesting. That if you recall, back in, what was it, 2006, 2007, something around there, Hugo Chavez started to push people out of PDVSA, especially people that actually knew what they were doing. There were some allegations with some of them, of course, that they were taking bribes or whatever, and maybe that's the case, I don't know. But at any rate, a lot of the people actually knew how to operate refineries, or knew how to dig wells, knew how to get oil out of the ground and get it to market, ended up leaving the company for one reason or another. Many of them were sort of exiled or left the country altogether to come to the U.S. And so there was a huge sort of brain drain, if you will, within PDVSA for quite a while, and going on to this day. And what Chavez would do back in the day is replace them with his friends, with his cronies, whoever he thought could do a good job running the company. And 9 times out of 10, he'd appoint someone, and then a year or two later they'd be arrested for taking bribes or stealing money, or whatever the case may be. So things have not gone well from a oversight or a sort of a professional level in PDVSA for quite a while now, coming up on 20 years probably, that things have just been kind of going downhill with people that aren't necessarily the best in class, running the company and basically running things into the ground. So that's why the infrastructure is in such a bad shape. Obviously, I don't want to say everyone who currently works for PDVSA doesn't know what they're doing. Obviously, there are people that do, but we know for sure that a lot of really knowledgeable people ended up leaving in that time period about 20 years ago. And apparently now that some of them at least are meeting in the US to figure out how to bring back PDVSA to its former glory. Because again, if you're, a citizen of Venezuela, that should be a point of pride. And it certainly was back in the 90s and the early 2000s how well PDVSA was running and you know how they were able to extract raw materials from the earth and sell it for a profit for their country's benefit. At any rate, so what are the oil companies saying now? What's sort of the pushback? Of course, low oil prices. So today we're sort of at 58 on WTI, just above 60 on Brent. That's probably not good enough from a price perspective, from a return on equity, or return on interest. Return on investment for these big oil companies to plow a lot of money into the situation without some other, some cushings or some backing or some sort of benefit, probably from the U.S. government of some sort. Um, again, prices are just too low for them to try to do that. Uh, you've got people in West Texas who have very good, wells ready to go. There's no real infrastructure uh, inhibiting them from being able to get to market. In other words, there's plenty of pipeline capacity and all that sort of stuff to get to market. So they're not spending money on that, yet prices are low enough where they're really questioning, should we continue to drill new holes and that sort of thing. So um, that's going to be a tough question, and I think a tough pushback for the president, and sort of what we think the overall plan is for now, at least what he said at the press conference on Saturday, and then in the subsequent news stories coming out. So that's going to be a significant hurdle to sort of rebuild. I guess these guys will have to take a really long term look at what the long term projections look like, and not just in the returns in the next sort of 6 to 12 months or whatever. Of course, like I said, the refining sector will have to be rebuilt as well. As I mentioned earlier, the really heavy crudes, you do need upgrading to get that to a point where it's marketable crude. So those two things sort of go hand in hand. A lot of this infrastructure is going to have to get built somewhere. I've already had some preliminary conversations with some people in the industry, that actually construct and build things like pipelines and refineries and whatnot. They do think there are a few companies in Venezuela that are able to construct and to work with the sorts of materials necessary to build a refinery. You just don't need you need somewhat specialized alloys and that sort of things when you're building refining capacity. Obviously depending on what sort of unit it is, but it's not immediately clear to me that you could rebuild the oil infrastructure within Venezuela. It's probably a lot of it's going to have to come from the U.S., I would imagine. Again, I would think that the White House, the administration, would try to put some sort of parameters on stuff like that. Whereas, my thinking is the president would probably say something along the lines of, as much of the stuff that needs to get built needs to be built in the U.S. and then shipped down there. If we can't do that in the U.S., then you can start to look other places at Europe or Brazil or wherever else. You can source fabrication and parts and that sort of thing. But I think the overall goal probably is to try to keep the manufacturing to the U.S. and then export it down to Venezuela. So probably keep that in mind too. I think that sort of folds in with our overall view of diesel demand for 2026 and beyond. That it will probably continue to grow, probably continue to be really strong, especially if we start, you know, building and constructing fabricating a lot of heavy steel parts that need to be shipped down to Venezuela. Just trying to get that from the fabrication facility to the dock to be shipped down to Venezuela, consumes a decent amount of diesel fuel. So that's the sort of thing we think overall is beneficial, from an oil perspective to the diesel market, but obviously from a larger perspective to overall GDP and that sort of thing. But then looking around a little bit, what are the implications going on? Of course, I was under the understanding that China was loaning money to Venezuela for various things, and Venezuela was paying them back with oil. The president made a statement on Saturday saying that, of course, China would have access to that oil. I wonder if that's the reason he said that specifically. We also know that there's only a couple places on Earth that currently you can process really heavy crude. One of them is the U.S. Gulf Coast. Another is the Med. There are a few, um, fairly complex refiners in the Med, or at least refiners that choose to make a lot of fuel oil in the Med. And then, of course, China has been building refineries capable of running heavy crude as well. So Venezuela was a pretty good supplier for China previously. One of the biggest, I would say, from Venezuela's perspective, China was one of the biggest customers. Um, and again, in my mind anyway, that's tied back to money that was lent to Venezuela as a way of paying them back. So take that for what it's worth. But one thing you got to consider is if all the U.S. companies, get the right incentives to go back into Brazil and to really plow a lot of money in there, is there enough uh, manpower? Is there enough brain power to go around to be able to really focus on Venezuela and then keep Canada going? If you think about it, the refiners in the Midwest in Pad 2, they consume quite a bit of heavy crude. The only place that they can get heavy crude from is Canada. If you look at it from the other direction, there's only so many places that Canada can export to. Of course, they've got that newish terminal, pipeline and terminal going to the west coast, so they are able to export a little bit from that terminal from the Trans Mountain pipeline system. But by and large, their largest customer is the U.S. So if Canada wanted to continue to grow production, and then there's various pipeline, uh, deals that they're talking about potentially making and whatnot. That production growth has to come from somewhere, and are we stretching ourselves too thin by trying to focus on both Venezuela and Canada? Not even from a U.S. perspective, but just there's only so many people in the world that know how to do this and to do it well. Who's going to get the benefit of that? So we'll see how that works out. And of course, as I'm sure you've been hearing, for various reasons, Colombia and Brazil should probably be, paying pretty close attention to what's going on. Historically, from an oil perspective, Colombia and Brazil have been getting, or have been quite a good exporter to the U.S. In times past. So again, that and their production, at least on Colombia, their production has been quite challenged here lately. Brazil seems to be doing a bit better in terms of the health of their overall oil market. But another thing I put in the Substack report, which I think you should go read because I go way more into detail about why exactly the U.S. needs more heavy crude and why Venezuelan crude is actually a really good fit for that. So maybe again, it helps to sort of tie these things together. But if you recall, off the coast of Guyana, there's a huge offshore find that Chevron and others made a couple of years back now, and it's producing really good medium grade crude that can go a long way to solving the Gulf Coast issues with trying to find heavier crude in the world. Especially in a time when Venezuela's crude oil exports were banned from the U.S. In my mind, if these oil companies didn't want to bother with rebuilding the dilapidated infrastructure onshore, maybe that's a good alternative for them. There had been fighting back and forth between Venezuela and Guyana about where exactly that border is in the ocean and whose oil is whose, and so with a sort of understanding that there's probably quite a bit of that same formation that goes on into Venezuela's own territorial waters, if you will. So again, maybe that's a watch that space. Maybe that's a good place for U.S. Oil companies to go and to try to develop production from there, rather than the onshore stuff where you have to rebuild all that infrastructure. Just go offshore, build your own setup from scratch, and not have to deal with the having to rehabilitate the whole system that was there before. So at any rate, please go visit our Substack. As I mentioned, I go a lot more into detail about what might be driving the overall push towards Venezuela. There's a lot of interesting things within the numbers of the oil market itself, within some of the stats that line up pretty good actually right now with needing more heavy crude. And then last thing I wanted to say is please go read this report. It's on the White House website. I think it makes a lot of sense of what's going on in the world right now, especially in regards to Venezuela, and just more reasons why Colombia and Brazil should probably be looking over their shoulder, trying to play nice with the U.S., at least in the meantime. But that's all I got. I have a couple more videos coming out here in the near future, so please look for those. Please like and subscribe, and visit our website for more information. That's oilbalance.com. Thank you. Bye.